So hi again, everybody, and welcome to the April session of BusinessWise Insiders. I'm just going to keep everybody on mute during the presentation portion of the session. That just helps minimize disruptions so we can get through the presentation part quickly and onto the conversation. As I said, it'll last about 20 or 25 minutes. And if you have a question, please feel free to ask it in the chat window. And if we don't have the opportunity to address it during the presentation, we can come back to it afterward. So today we're going to be taking a look at the challenge of objection handling, what to do when your prospects say no in various forms. Before we start, I want to emphasize that the no's we're talking about for the purposes of this presentation are the ones that you get at the very beginning of the prospecting process, when you're working to start conversations and set first-time appointments with new prospects. And even though some of the material in this presentation may apply later in the process, we're really focused on overcoming that initial resistance to a first-time appointment. So with that in mind, put yourself in that mindset of reaching out to a new prospect for the first time. What do you say when you reach out, whether it's over the phone or in an email, to ask for your prospect's time, and your prospect says no? And there are a couple of important points here. First, this is almost a trick question because just about everyone says no to that first ask. So really what we're asking here is, when that initial resistance inevitably comes, are you prepared to respond, and what is your strategy? But let's back up for a second and look a little closer at the question of why should you even care about no and what to say? Now, you might be thinking, of course, sales reps can't take no for an answer. We deal with no all the time. And you're right. The first reason we need a strategy for no is that no is a fact of life in B2B sales. A sales rep doing cold outreach and not having a strategy for a no is sort of like a golfer not having a strategy for when you don't get a hole in one. Of course, we want the immediate and eager yes, just like we want a hole in one, but that's not realistic. No's are part of the game. But I still see it so many times. Sales reps become so fixated on that explicitly promising lead where a prospect raises their hand and eagerly accepts a request for a meeting that they run past any signs of resistance. Their no strategy essentially becomes, no problem, thanks for your time, let me know if your mind changes. But the reason no's are potential opportunities is because they're often not actually no. A no, especially at the beginning of the cold prospecting process, really means I don't see value yet, and that's okay. Just like the golfer's job is to move the ball toward a tiny hole that's hundreds of yards away over bunkers and hazards and rough, it's the sales rep's job to move a prospect toward a yes in the face of resistance by helping them understand and perceive the value they bring. And the final lesson here is that it's not just about pushing back at resistance. You can't just tell your prospect they're wrong, because you will never win that argument. Instead, you need to change their perspective by getting at what they care about. So there's obviously a lot going on here, which is why it's really important to approach the challenge of objection handling with a solid blueprint that prepares you to deal with a couple of pivotal questions. And the first question, especially at the very beginning of a prospect interaction, those first few seconds where all you're asking for is a few moments of your prospect's time, is whether the resistance they offer reflects a legitimate concern or is just an attempt at brushing you off. And brush-offs are automatic. The prospect doesn't even know what they're objecting to yet. They might take the form of, I can't talk right now, I'm heading into a meeting, just send me an email, or even just, sorry, I'm not interested. And they can sound like legitimate objections, but in reality, they're just avoidance tactics on the prospect's part. And with brush-offs, your goal should be to do whatever you can to pivot toward the substance in that moment. And you can do that by framing a short conversation now as a time saver for your prospect. Something like, I don't want to waste your time, rather than calling you back later. Let's figure out whether this is even a priority for you and whether it would be worth it for you to hear some ideas about how to address it. The second blueprint issue is recognizing that there's a difference between resistance over the phone and resistance over email, because each presents different challenges and opportunities. Resistance over the phone is high pressure, But with the right strategy, it's often easier to turn into a conversation because you've already got your prospect in that conversation. For example, when you try the tactic I just mentioned in response to a brush off, they pretty much have to answer you. And there's a decent chance that they'll agree to talk for a few moments right then and there. In contrast, it's much easier to ghost someone over email. But with email, you have an opportunity to show your prospect that there's a real person on the other side, which isn't always clear when they first get your outreach. Any kind of response gives you the chance to start a one-on-one conversation, which is really the ultimate goal of any email prospecting campaign. And as a bonus, whereas cold calling often is about either now or never, asynchronous conversations like email are often more likely to be resurrected at some future date than conversations that start with a cold call. So as you approach objection handling, make sure you tailor your tactics to your outreach channel and understand the challenges and opportunities presented by both. And here's a basic roadmap you can use to approach any kind of objection. Embrace, inform, and ask. So the first part, embrace, really gets down to don't ignore or bulldoze your prospect's objection. Show your prospect you're listening by acknowledging the objection and then using it as a pivot point. And the first thing you want to pivot to is to informing your prospect, showing your prospect that you have insights and ideas into the challenges they face, and that's value that they get from a conversation with you, even if it never goes any further. And then critically ask questions, because that's how to dig deeper into what your prospect cares about, and it's how you steer the conversation toward more friendly and more fruitful ground. And of course, the key here is to be able to deftly navigate this path, to use bridge statements that get you from embracing the objection to informing to asking. And we'll talk about how to use this roadmap with specific objections in a moment. And of course, how you use that roadmap will depend on the kind of resistance your prospect offers. So different categories of resistance will lend themselves to different strategies for shifting your prospect's perspective. So today we'll do our own digging into these 4 common objections: not interested, happy with the way things are, bad experience, they tried it before and it was terrible, bad timing, which can take a lot of forms, a lot going on, no budget, contract isn't up, or more info, not right now, but send me some info and I'll get back to you. And we'll look at what these might really mean and the specific tactics you can use to steer the conversation in a promising direction. But before we get into the specifics here, I just wanted to invite Deborah to offer any other introductory thoughts.
Thanks, Sam. As you said, expect resistance. It's coming. And that's why we have to practice our response, whether it's via email or on the phone. And let's try and remain curious about where our prospect is and move toward our goal of either meeting with that prospect or disqualifying them.
Exactly. And we'll talk a little bit about how that applies in each of the different scenarios. So let's get started by looking at each objection a little more closely and seeing how you can use it to dig deeper and potentially move the conversation forward. So objection number 1 is not interested, status quo is good. So here you have a prospect giving a sort of all-encompassing version of the not interested objection. Not interested, things are fine, we're happy with our current vendor, we don't need it. Underneath, you have some possible subtext, what they might actually be saying that gives you an opportunity to show some value. So what that might mean on the top would be, it hadn't occurred to me that I might have a problem or that I could benefit from a solution. And the key phrase here is, it hadn't occurred to me. Again, no means I don't see value yet. And the reason it hasn't occurred to them is because they don't know what you know, that the ideas, insights, and ultimately products and services that you bring to the table can provide a better understanding of what really matters to their success. So the not interested objection in particular is one of the most common catch-all ways a prospect can resist. They can use it to brush you off, but can also be a substantive concern, and it can take many forms. This problem isn't important right now. I don't see the benefit. We don't have that problem. Things are going fine. It's a blank slate that invites you to respond with open-ended questions to uncover pain. Now, a few years ago, the first question here might have been something like, well, if X isn't a problem, then can you tell me what problems and priorities you're facing? But any sales rep can ask questions about pain, And in that transaction, the prospect really receives nothing of benefit. In fact, they're giving information to you when it should really be the other way around. So the new tactic is, again, to help clarify pain for your prospect by offering ideas and insights that you know will matter to them. Of course, you can also flip it around and focus on what is working, which is a great way to get your prospect talking and presents new opportunities for a conversation. And the last question here is an example of a question that we at BusinessWise might use, but you can adapt it to whatever product, service, or solution you offer. Clarifying questions like these rephrase and reframe the issue and might get a different response that can lead to a conversation. And some key takeaways. Again, expect and prepare for resistance. So again, back to the golf analogy, golfers don't come to play with only a driver in their bag. They put a dozen different clubs in their bag and they practice hitting out of the rough and out of the sand. Sales reps should be clear on the value you bring to the first appointment, even if the prospect will never buy. And you should be comfortable with the number of different ways to reframe the issue in a way that helps clarify what they really want and need. And as you uncover what's important to them, you may find it appropriate, as Deborah mentioned, to disqualify a prospect. That sets up the interaction as a two-way street. You only can help people that you can help. So you determine with whom you want to meet based on whether you think they can provide something that benefits them. Deb, did you have anything to add here?
Some of us only want to meet with our prospects when they're in a buying mode. And for others of us, we want to meet with our dream prospects wherever they are in the buying cycle. What's important is to determine where you are on that continuum, and then you can determine how to create compelling talk tracks that fit your situation.
Thanks, Deb. So that brings us to objection number 2, which is bad timing. And bad timing is one of those objections, again, that can take many different forms. A prospect might just have a lot going on at the moment, so no time to focus on the issue, or the issue that you're looking to help address isn't a priority. Or maybe it's that the budget isn't there right now, or that they just signed a contract with another vendor. It all boils down to not right now. But what they may really mean is, I have a decent reason to say no now, but under different circumstances, I might say yes. And that's good because it means there's a promising flip side to the bad timing objection that another time might be better. And the best way to unpack the bad timing objection is to get at the root of why that might be the case. So here you have a few different options. First is to go right to the heart of the objection. Again, embrace it. If it's a bad time and something is keeping them from addressing their problems, which itself is a problem. The second is to emphasize that you're not asking them for anything more than a no strings attached meeting. They'll get some ideas. It costs them nothing. So timing and budget shouldn't even be a concern. And finally, another time really might actually be better, which gives you an opportunity to create a mutually agreed upon time frame for follow-up. So it gives you sort of a couple different opportunities to either have the conversation now about why timing is an issue, or set up a follow-up opportunity for later. So to put it simply, ask if not now, when and why. Because bad timing often means either we don't think we have the budget right now, or we don't see this as a high priority right now. And that's your cue to offer insights and ideas and change their perspective. And if in doing so, you can demonstrate value in the form of ROI, then a budget may magically appear and the time may be right. And again, if it isn't the right time, in actuality, if their contract isn't up, if there's an opportunity to follow up later, then you create a follow-up plan. Anything here, Deb?
When you want to know when to follow up, let your prospect name the time. So when you tell them, I don't want to keep bugging you, when should I check back, is much more important than saying, should I follow up next quarter? Because maybe, and they'll say yes, but maybe they would have given you 2 weeks.
Exactly. So objection number 3 is when a prospect has had a bad experience with a similar product or service in the past. So in the top here, you have your prospect saying, I tried something similar before and it was terrible. I'm not making the same mistake twice. But on the bottom, here's what they really mean. I had a problem. I tried to fix it. It didn't work. And now I'm afraid of spending money on another doomed attempt. And the bad experience objection is an explicit acknowledgement that your prospect knows she has a problem that needs fixing. And since uncovering pain is the first step towards discussing solutions, this kind of objection is actually a great opportunity to ask pointed questions and get your prospect talking. In some ways, it means your prospect has two problems. They have the original problem, and now they have a fear of addressing it. And you can use both to illustrate the costs of inaction. And our takeaways here are really meant to emphasize that the bad experience objections presents a target-rich environment for clarifying your prospects' problems and changing their perspective. There's the old problem, which hasn't gone away. There's the new problem, the fear of acting and failing. And all of this can help you reframe their definition of value. Your unique value, your insights in combination with your solution, will help them see and solve problems in a way that no one else can. Deborah, any ideas here? Okay, so on to the final objection, which is send me more info. So send more info is a little bit tough because it can seem less like an objection than it actually is, and it can tempt you to handle it in the wrong way. It seems like they're almost inviting an opportunity to engage, but maybe it's a brush off, and maybe they're just setting you up to ignore you later. In other words, send me more info could be a non-confrontational way of saying no. So if you take them at their word and you send them some info with the hope that they'll call you back eager to meet, they very likely will not. That's what they want you to do so they can ignore you. But luckily, it opens the door to reframing your prospect's problem and delivering value on issues that resonate with them. So what's the best strategy in this case? Again, you can take this in a few different directions. The first is to take their objection as a cue to show them you don't want to waste their time. Sort of like the same tactic I suggest at the beginning with respect to brush-offs. More info won't help if it's not relevant to their needs, so pointing them to your website probably won't help. So instead, offer a short, no strings attached meeting as a far better alternative. They'll gain ideas and insights, and you'll be able to better understand what they really want and need. And in some ways, that meeting is a time saver because it removes steps in the interaction, and it gets straight to the chase about what they're actually looking for. And then finally, as a last resort, again, you can use their own request to create a follow-up plan, which may give you another chance to ask some of those same questions. So if I send you some materials ASAP, and then I'll follow up in such and such time frame, does that sound good? And of course, one thing to be careful about here is the endless email stall, where you end up being strung along by a prospect. So if possible, aim to get your answer on that first call rather than kick the can down the road. Otherwise, be very clear and strategic about your follow-up plan. So digging for what they really are asking, and then creating a follow-up plan based on what they say creates that additional opportunity to engage. Deborah, anything on send more info from you?
Sometimes if the situation calls for it and you think send me more information is just a brush off, you can certainly tell your prospect that you'd be happy to send more information. At the same time, if this is a brush off, you're okay with them telling you so.
Exactly. So that's actually the end of the substantive part of the presentation. And I know we breezed through some of these slides pretty quickly, and there are some example ideas of how to deal with the specific resistance that you might encounter on a cold call. Just a reminder, we'll share the presentation with everybody who registered after the session's over. So you'll be able to pour through this and take away some of these specific ideas. But also, as we transition over to the breakout discussion, we can talk through how these different types of objections manifest themselves on a call or in the email, and share some ideas for how to respond.